All right. Aloha and welcome everybody to the November 2021 edition of Third Thursday, still virtual, but we're getting there, I'm sure. We hope that you are all well and in good spirits. If you're new to us and new to Third Thursday, this is our chance to share the expertise and insights of some of the folks that we have the good fortune to work with. And today is no exception to that. We've got a couple of great folks here for you and some exciting and very relevant information. Okay, so thank you very much for joining us. All right, before we launch into the presentations though, I do want to make an update on the center. And for those of you that were with us last time, you know that we had made the announcement that our delivery team, the team that's responsible for actually implementing the training, was a finalist for the RCUH Team of the Year Award. And in the month or so that has passed since our last Third Thursday, we are very pleased to announce that they in fact won that award. And so they are the RCUH, that's the Research Corporation of the University of Hawaii, Team of the Year. This is a tremendous accomplishment for this special group of people. They earned it because of our ability to pivot quickly from completely in-person delivery of our training to completely virtual. And that, as you can imagine, required a ton of work, shifting of all kinds of duties, shifting of work schedules, just a bunch of great folks being really flexible and moving into new areas that has resulted in our success with online deliveries. So I want to recognize them and congratulate them. You see the three photos there, that's the official announcement. But beyond Lydia, Melissa, and Amanda, of course, the team itself extends beyond that. The nomination required that we limit it to 3 individuals, but the actual nomination was for the entire team. So I do want to recognize them today and make sure that we call them out for their hard work and commitment as well. So Danette, Jay, Herman, Marvelyn, and Stephen, these are all folks probably that you guys, or many of you, are familiar with. They are our frontline. They are our first responders. And you probably had interaction with them over the years, and they are definitely part of this delivery team that has really that have won the award and really accomplished this on behalf of the center. And I have a picture there of them. That's one of their deliveries, hard at work at their deliveries there, as you can see. Oh no, that's the wrong pic. No, I'm kidding. That's one of their get-togethers where they strategize how to improve our online deliveries. Okay. Anyway, I do want to read real quickly from the announcement because I think it bears repeating. So the conversion of NDPTC training from in-person to online has required the delivery team to substantially revise its daily work and processes, and they have done so with professionalism, competence, and enthusiasm. And I can't think of a better way to put it. They've just done a tremendous job and really benefited not only us as a center, but the entire consortium because of their work. So congratulations to them. And thanks to RCUH for recognizing them. There was a pool of about 25 nominations, and I'm sure they were all very strong. A lot of folks had to really work hard this past year, try new things and change things up. So this is a real testimony to our delivery team's hard work. So congratulations again on that. Really happy to announce that. I do want to mention that, you know, as great as this additional activity has been, and you know, the shift to online and all that, it has created an enormous amount of work, of course, within the center, and nobody felt that additional work more than our Associate Director for Administration, Nathan Lee. He was the guy that had to do all of the paperwork and the processing to accommodate the hard work that the delivery folks were doing. Yet he was the one who actually pushed the nomination through, made sure that we met all of the criteria, make sure we met the deadlines and everything. So I want to call him out, because the one guy who bore the brunt of the success of the delivery team was the one who actually pushed this nomination through. So I want to thank Nate, and you know, that's a testimony to the team that we've got here at NDPTC. Okay, so with that happy news, I'd like to turn it over to Rcuh to announce our presenters for today and get going there. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Russell. Yeah, congratulations again to Lydia, Mel, Amanda, and the rest of the delivery team. So today we have two exciting presentations, and I just wanted to introduce the presenters. So we have Dr. Julia Crowley, who used to actually work with us at NDPTC, but now she's an assistant professor at Western Carolina University. And she's, her research interests include disaster debris management, hazard mitigation, social vulnerability, risk perception, and environmental justice. And she also graduated from the PhD program at University of Hawaii at Manoa. And while she was at NDPTC, she helped to develop a training course on disaster debris management planning. And our other presenter is Dennis Hwang, who's a coastal hazard mitigation specialist with the Sea Grant program at University of Hawaii. And he combines his science and law background to focus on implementing sciences into the community for the areas of hurricanes, tsunamis, floods, erosions, wind and earthquake impacts. And so Dennis authored the Hawaii Coastal Hazard Mitigation Guidebook, which is used in the land use process. And there was a similar version that was also produced for Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina. And so he also co-authored the Homeowner's Handbook for Natural Hazards, which is in its second edition. And so yeah, his presentation is going to focus on a lot of those things today. So yeah, we look forward to hearing from both of you, and thank you so much for speaking at our third Thursday. So I think first we're going to have Julia presenting.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you very much for the introduction, Rcuh. Thank you to everyone for taking the time to listen to my presentation. I will be presenting about some research that I recently published in the International Journal of Disaster Risk Science. And this research examines the relationship between social vulnerability factors and reported post-disaster needs following Hurricane Florence. So I would like to begin by giving you a little bit of background information on the event of Hurricane Florence. This storm first made landfall near the coast of North Carolina, more specifically near the town of Wrightsville Beach on September 14th of 2018. And at the time of landfall, Florence was detected to be a Category 1 hurricane, but nonetheless, it has still gone down as being among the 10 costliest hurricanes in U.S. history. And a lot of this is because at least 50% of the damage has been attributed to uninsured residential losses due to flooding. Now, when Florence made landfall back in 2018, I was at the beginning of my second year in my current position as an assistant professor at Western Carolina University. And we're located near the western tip of the state. So we were not near the eye or the eye wall, but we did get a lot of heavy rains due to the outer rain bands. And several of my students were from communities that were directly impacted by Florence. So I became really interested in this event, and more specifically in social vulnerability and how that impacted both the response and the recovery. So in going through the literature on social vulnerability and natural disasters, I found that there are a number of past published studies that have developed different types of indexes for understanding social vulnerability in this context. But I also came across an additional body of literature that examines the factors that influence one's willingness to request assistance following a disaster. And I found that a lot of this literature also connected that willingness back to the social vulnerability factors that were identified in the different indexes. So in combining all these different bodies of literature, I came up with 7 of the social vulnerability factors that were frequently discussed. And these included income, education, gender, elderly populations, young children, non-English speaking populations, and minority populations. So this now brings me to the purpose of my research study, and that was to examine if the social vulnerability factors that were identified in the literature are predictors of reported post-disaster needs following Hurricane Florence. So now I get into my variables, but first I'd like to explain that due to the magnitude of Hurricane Florence, certain areas received major disaster declarations through FEMA and the federal government, and individual assistance was granted to specific parts of North Carolina and South Carolina. So my level of analysis for this study was the zip code. So these were all the zip codes that received individual assistance. I had 3 dependent variables with 3 separate models. The first one was the reported per capita emergency needs following Florence. The second one consisted of the reported per capita food needs. And the third and final model had a dependent variable that was the reported per capita shelter needs. My independent variables consisted of the 7 social vulnerability factors that I previously discussed on the slide related to the literature review. But I also included 4 additional control variables. 2 of these were event specific. So one of them was the peak gust in miles per hour, and then the other one was the distance to the coast in miles. And then I also included 2 additional control variables that accounted for different types of flood hazard mitigation factors. One of these was the proportion of homeowners with flood insurance. Now, while this flood hazard mitigation technique might not necessarily prevent damage, it can reduce the loss following the storm, and it can also influence how likely the individual insurance holder might need to report additional needs or might not to report additional needs. And then the other control variable related to flood hazard mitigation was the median home value, because there have been a lot of past research studies that have detected an inverse relationship between appraised home values and flood damage. And then finally, the sample size for this study was 406, and this was the total of zip codes that received individual assistance for Florence in North Carolina and South Carolina. So now I get into my methodology. The database that I created to analyze my data was derived from 3 different sources, and one of those was FEMA. So anytime that a major disaster declaration is granted, information in the form of Excel files related to individual assistance and public assistance is made available to the public on the FEMA website. So I downloaded a file that was all about the individual assistance for Florence, and it gave specific information about different types of disaster needs. So that's where I got the information for my dependent variables. In terms of the 2 control variables that measured event-specific information, I used Hazard. More specifically, I ran the HRVAC model for Florence to gather data related to the peak gusts and the distance to the coast. And then all of the other variables, the 7 social vulnerability factors, as well as the 2 flood hazard mitigation factors, were derived from a software program called Simply Analytics, where I was able to look all of this information up at the zip code level. And as I mentioned earlier, my level of analysis are the zip codes that received individual assistance. And then for analyzing my data, I originally ran ordinary least square regressions for the 3 models, but when I was checking my assumptions, I found there to be some heteroscedasticity in the data. So for that reason, I chose to rerun the data with weighted least square regression models. And this is a good option if you're working with a dependent variable that is continuous, but you find there to be some heteroscedasticity in the data because it will adjust for that. So now I get into my results of my 3 weighted least square regression models, starting with model 1. And in this model, the dependent variable was the reported per capita emergency needs following Florence. And so 5 of the 7 social vulnerability factors were statistically significant predictors in this model for the reported emergency needs. The proportion of the female population, the proportion of the population over the age of 65, and the proportion of the population aged 5 and under were all positive predictors of reporting emergency needs. On the other hand, the proportion of the population that does not speak English and is over the age of 5, and the proportion of the minority population were negative predictors of reporting emergency needs. Then I get into my second model, and this model measured the reported per capita food needs as a dependent variable. And like the previous model, 5 of the 7 social vulnerability factors were statistically significant predictors of the dependent variable, but there was a little bit of variation in which variables. So the proportion of the female population and the proportion of the population aged 5 and under, like in the previous model, were positive predictors of the reported food needs. Then the proportion of the population that does not speak English and the proportion of the minority population were also negative predictors. But then there was an additional variable in this model, and that was the proportion of the population aged 25 and over with a bachelor's degree was also a negative predictor of reporting food needs. And then my third and final model measured the reported per capita shelter needs as the dependent variable. And for this model, 3 of the 7 social vulnerability factors were statistically significant predictors of the dependent variable. And so the proportion of the population over the age of 65 and the proportion of the population aged 5 and under were both positive predictors of the reported shelter needs. And then the proportion of the population that does not speak English over the age of 5 was a negative predictor. So now I get into my discussion, and I found that overall, the findings of my research were supported by the literature. One example was a paper that was published in 1998 by Fothergill. And this study found that females had disproportionately higher caregiving responsibilities than male household members, and that made them more likely to request assistance following a disaster. And this finding was also supported in my research in Model 1 with the reported emergency needs and Model 2 with the reported food needs, where the proportion of the female population was a positive predictor. Another paper published in 2012 by Horton found language barriers to be a hindrance to requesting disaster assistance. And this finding was also supported in my research in all three models, where the proportion of the non-English speaking populations were all negative predictors of reporting needs related to emergencies, food, or shelter following Florence. And then another paper published in 2016 by Rivera found that disaster assistance decreases as education increases. And this inverse relationship was also reflected in my second model, where the proportion of the population age 25 and over with a bachelor's degree was a negative predictor of the reported food needs. Then some additional literature. Malik et al. Concluded that elderly populations have an overall higher risk of emergency department visits following a disaster event. And this finding was supported in my first model that measured the reported emergency needs as a dependent variable. And going back to that model, the proportion of the population over the age of 65 was a positive predictor of those reported emergency needs. And then James et al. Found there to be a lack of culturally appropriate emergency risk communication for minorities. And this finding was also supported in my first two models, where the proportion of the minority population was a negative predictor of the reported emergency needs, as well as a reported food needs following Florence. But one other thing I wanted to note about the literature was that there were conflicting viewpoints related to the role of income in influencing one's willingness to request assistance after a disaster. One example, a paper published by Fothergill in 2003 found that disaster assistance was viewed as a threat to middle-class status. And that paper concluded that for that reason, the middle class were less likely to request aid following a disaster. But then on the other hand, Urmson et al. Determined that an individual's socioeconomic status was not related to their comfort level in seeking disaster assistance. And so for all three of my models, income was not a statistically significant predictor of either reported emergency needs, food needs, or shelter needs. And this could be due to the high level of variation as far as the role of income in influencing an individual's decision to report needs after a disaster. Now I get into my recommendations, the main recommendation being that more attention should be given to these vulnerable populations in the pre-disaster planning process before the disaster occurs. And I think one variable I'd like to focus on for this presentation is the non-English speaking populations, because that was a statistically significant predictor in all three of my models. And it was also a negative predictor for reporting emergency needs, food needs, and shelter needs. And so I think it's really, really important that FEMA work with local communities, be it the local emergency management agencies, as well as different community leaders, to really understand the language needs and be able to identify any potential language barriers and work with translators to make sure that everyone in the community is getting the information that they need in situations where they might be eligible for individual assistance, and they are needing information about where to go to report their needs and how to go through the application process. So that concludes my presentation. I've included the citation for the publication. Now, the International Journal of Disaster Risk Science is an open access journal. So if you're wanting the full text, you should be able to access it through sites like Google Scholar or the website. But I've also included my email address here. I can also provide you with a copy of the full text if you'd like. So I will take questions at the end after Dennis's presentation, and thank you everyone very much for taking the time to listen to my research presentation.
Oh, thank you, Julia. That was great. Okay, so next we have Dennis.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Julia. That was very good. And I'm going to share my screen now. Could you see that, Ricky?
Yeah, it looks good. I think you may just have to put it in that full screen view.
Okay. Let's see. How's that? Okay, can everyone see that okay, Ricky?
Yeah, it looks good. It looks good. Thanks, Dennis.
Okay, well, thanks. And hello, everyone. Glad you could make it today. And I'm going to talk about a field trip. We went to Louisiana for Hurricane Ida. And we did a paper. This is my contact information. I'm not going to say it's by myself, but the paper is Hurricane Ida Damage Typologies, Resilient Repair, Rebuild, Retrofit, and Recode. And here are the partners for the project. It was the University of Hawaii Sea Grant, National Disaster Preparedness Training Center, LSU Sea Grant. I see some LSU people are on the call today. And also St. Charles Parish. We're working with the St. Charles Parish Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness Office, Simpson Strong Tie, and the Pacific Urban Resilience Lab. So everyone played a role in some manner. In we did produce a final paper or initial paper, and it's actually online now, but everyone was involved in that. Okay, so here's Hurricane Ida, made landfall August 29th as a Category 4, 1 minute sustained winds of 150 miles per hour. Landfall was Port Fourchon, Louisiana. And we actually, I did go down there October 4th to the 11th. So that was a little over a month after landfall. And the purpose of going down there was to update or inform current guidance and courses. So we have the Homeowner's Handbook to Prepare for Natural Hazards in Hawaii, and there's one in Louisiana. And both of these books, they cover, hazard risk, hazard science, emergency preparedness, evacuation planning, and preparing your home for a hazard. So that was really the main reason. We wanted to see what we could learn about house, preparation for a hazard like Ida. And also National Disaster Preparedness Training Center was involved. They have several courses like community resilience, flood hazard awareness, hurricane awareness, coastal hazards course. And so through these site visits, we could learn more and possibly update or inform these courses. And then also, we did wind up producing this paper, which I just mentioned. And that was at the request of St. Charles Parish and the St. Charles Parish Homeland Security Emergency Preparedness Office. So here's just a figure that shows landfall of Ida at Port Fourchon and you could see the path. It was a Category 4 heading in this direction. Then it turned suddenly to the right and actually impacted St. Charles Parish even more as a Category 3, and then continued up as a Category 2. You could see the wind gust, and this is all from National Weather Service. And what we have here is the first day we were down there, we went to Homa, Dulac, and Cocodrie. Okay, the second day was to Grand Isle, and this is would be in the right front quadrant of the hurricane on the coastline. So it would have different impacts. And then the next day was in Little Kalo, and the next day we were we were in St. Charles Parish, and then the next day Lafitte, This was unusual in that this area had the most of the levees in Louisiana and New Orleans held, but in this location, the levee got overtopped. So we're going to see what it looked like there. And then we went back to St. Charles Parish. So here is Grand Isle, and this is where it's in the right front quadrant of the hurricane. And you can see on the upper left corner is a satellite image before Ida, and you can see this mouse or hand there. And this is location. You can see there's a fair amount of vegetation in front of these houses, and then there's the beach in front of it. So that's before Ida, and then after Ida, you can see these same places, okay? And now there's been erosion of this amount of land, and there's a channel cutting across, and there's all these scour pits landward of these structures. So this is receiving the full coastal impacts of Hurricane Ida. This area, you're getting erosion, scour, wave inundation, surge, inland rain, and wind, okay? So, and then in this picture in the lower left, you see this, you can see the address here, 1958, which is the same as this 1958 in the upper. And you can see here's the scour pit. It's undermining this house here. And the next house in the lower right corner, you're having several impacts. You're having scour undermining the house on the seaward, on the landward part of the house. You're having erosion undermining the house on the landward side of the house, and you're having wind impacts that blew off this roof. So you're having multiple impacts from the hurricane, and you know, that's what you would expect on the coastline there. Okay, and here again, here's the same picture blown up, and you could see the scour and the erosion in the front and the roof blowing off. Okay, and here's another picture from the seaward side of that house, and you'd see the erosion along the shore. There would have been a lot more houses that would have been undermined, but there was a large sand, a boudin, I guess they call it, that was protecting a large section of the shoreline. But in this area, it did get undermined. Okay, and here is also a Grand Isle, and you could see for this house, you could see the roof that just came off, and when this happens, catastrophic loss. We're going to cover this more in things that could be done. But I don't want to just show damage, because it's just as important that we show successes, houses that performed well. And the ones that were built the most recently with modern building codes, elevated. This is houses probably a little above base flood elevation. You can see the windows are protected. Did have very minor damage of the soffits here. Okay, so this, but generally it performed well. And you could see all through our site visits, there's going to be a great discrepancy in the level of damage, because just a small breach can lead to catastrophic damage. Okay, here's another house that performed well, elevated above, you know, flood levels, maybe above base flood elevation, and located away from the coast. Windows protected with Bahama shutters. It has a hip style roof and a metal roof. They generally perform very well. This is probably built under modern building codes, and you can see the big difference between these two houses that I showed last and the ones before that. Tremendous difference in performance, and it would see from the outside, you would see, oh, it doesn't seem like much of a difference, but in the inside, there's a tremendous difference in strength. Okay, a lot of people will say, how is Ida? You know, how did the levees hold up? Well, generally they did pretty good, unlike Katrina, where they where there was a levee breach or the flood walls broke, were damaged or failed. Here in this part of New Orleans, and these are rough elevations, but you can see Lake Pontchartrain here is at 0 feet. This area is -2. It's actually below Lake Pontchartrain, and it's separated by this levee here. So there wasn't the amount of flooding damage from Ida that we saw in Katrina. But there was one area, and we pointed that out in the map, Lafitte, where the levee was overtopped. The levee was only 7 or 8 feet, and the water level was 10 to 12 feet. And once there's a overtopping or a breach of a levee, it could be really catastrophic. Okay, for the properties that are being protected. Okay, here's an example of Lafitte, and you can see there's a combination of wind damage here, siding coming off, roofing coming off. The roof came off here, but then also the structure got lifted off its foundation, and you can see like watermarks along the side of the house. And here's another house in Lafitte, and you can see that this house got washed off its foundation, floated off its foundation, was moved like 150 or 200 feet, and this is what the inside looks like. So very important, especially when you're in the water, near the water, to use siding measures. You know, siding is important, especially if there's storm surge or erosion, but also you want to make sure you're properly elevated. Elevate at least the base flood elevation, preferably higher. Okay, so here we are in St. Charles. Okay, so most of the report that we did dealt with St. Charles, and we went to St. Charles for 2 days. This is at the Emergency Preparedness Office. Here's myself, and here's Tab Troxler. He's an instructor at NDPTC, and he's also the tax assessor for St. Charles. And then Nikki Pace and Jim Wilkins are LSU Sea Grant. And then here's Jason Taster and Joe Gano. And here's the president of St. Charles Parish, Matt Jewell. He's pretty tall. He's a basketball player. But anyway, they did, when we were there, they did request that we put together some guidance for them to help to deal with some of their properties. And what they're dealing with is, and I never got final numbers yet, but they're out there, but there's 36,000 parcels in St. Charles Parish, and a good number of them all had roof damage. This is the most common type of damage that we saw in St. Charles, and it's all different kinds, and we're going to explain a little bit about that. Okay, and what we saw was generally the older houses, they weren't built to modern building codes, and they didn't perform as well. And a lot of times the older houses are owned by poorer people, but not necessarily all the time. But in general, the older the house, it didn't perform as well. So there would be, when there was damage, wind damage, they would be more likely to have the roofs blow off, or sometimes the walls collapse in. And then for the newer houses, they did generally better, but there was still roof damage. And you could see all the blue tarps that are there when you drive through St. Charles Parish. Now, when you look at these blue tarps, you cannot tell offhand just by the outside of what's causing that damage. And there's a lot of things that could be going on. So we'll go over that. Okay, so here are some things that could cause roof damage. Okay, 1, the roof can blow off. Okay, 2, the plywood deck and could blow off the trusses of the structure. And we see a lot of this, okay? 3, the asphalt shingles and the underlayment could blow off the plywood deck. And then 4, a lot of times we see leakage or water infiltration from other means like soffits that are coming off the structure, okay? You see the soffits missing right here. And of course, they're missing siding there. So how do we prevent this damage? So in the report, we cover all the major types of damage that we saw and make recommendations on how to prevent that damage, either through repair, retrofit, or rebuild. And it should also be considered we also think they should consider addressing it through codes, or we say recode, but really it's just, amending your codes when you evaluate all this damage. Okay, so for the roof to blow off, the key is to tie your roof to the wall, okay? And these are different types of roof to wall connectors. We worked with Simpson Strong Tie. This is their latest set of connectors for the roof to wall connection. You also want to have a continuous load path, okay? A continuous load path ties your roof to the foundation, and each intersection has a key connector. So here are your roof to wall ties. These tie your second floor to your first floor. And here you're tying, say, your stud to your sill plate to your foundations here. That's a continuous load path. You want that in modern building codes, it's required, and you want that when you rebuild. Say you have to rebuild the entire house, you'll have to put the load path in. But it may also be possible to put major parts of it in as a retrofit or a repair, okay? And that's what's in the book also. How do we retrofit or repair to add as much of the load path as possible? Okay, the other thing, plywood sheathing coming off the trusses, okay? This was pretty common, and in the book, and we cite a lot of different sources, and this one was from the APA report for building high wind resilience and light wood frame construction. Recommend ring shank nails and that spacing that's tighter than current code. I'm going to go through this real quick. When your shingles blow off and your underlayment comes off, you may not think that this is a big deal, but when you actually go inside a house and go in the attic, you'll see this. You can see the rays of light that at the seams of the plywood decking, and this is where water can infiltrate. And you can see this house, it did not have structural damage, and the roof deck did not come off, and yet the entire house had to be gutted. That's because there was water infiltration through the seams of the plywood deck, and the water would collect on the ceiling, and then it would run over to the side of the house and run down the walls, and eventually the ceiling collapsed, and the entire house had to be gutted. Okay, so in order to prevent that, in order to prevent water infiltration through the plywood decking, they recommend us creating a sealed roof, and a lot of this is in the FEMA Building Science branch's library. Here's the citation to it, but there are 3 options to do a sealed roof, and it's actually the second one's pretty simple, because you're going to use an underlayment anyway, but it's essentially put self-adhering asphalt tape along the seams, all the seams where the plywood deck is, okay? And then a more protective measure is to use a continuous layer of modified asphalt, self-adhering modified bitumen layer, okay? And here's an actual installation creating a sealed roof using this option 1. Okay, so in the book, I'm not going to go over this because we don't have time, but there's different failure modes that we identify soffits coming off, siding coming off, fascia covers coming off, windows being broken. So it's in the report that we wrote, and I'll give you the reference to it later. And whenever you see there's a lot of debris, that's a sign that there's water infiltration. And sometimes it's obvious, like the roof of the house will be off, or the decking will be off the trusses, but sometimes it's not obvious. Like say this house here, it doesn't look like there's any roofing damage, but look at all the insulation that's out there. That's because it's been saturated. Same with this house here. So another reason we went out there, and our work was supported by NDPTC, is to feed some of their courses. They have a debris management course. Here's a debris pile in St. Charles Parish. They separate household debris and landscaping garden debris, and they had like 13 contractors from 13 different states that were part of their debris plan. There's a course by NDPTC on community resilience, and also one on flood hazards. And here is just shows a critical facility in Lafitte that's being flooded by the overtopping of the levee. There's a coastal hazards course, and here we see a house being wiped off its columns and by storm surge. And then there's a hurricane hazards course. We saw this house before. It has scour in the back, erosion in the front, and the roof being blown off. Okay, so this is another reason why we have these courses. One of the things we want to mention is the measures that we have in the paper are for primarily, you would think, oh, for people that are rebuilding, say their house has been damaged or destroyed, you want to rebuild, but some may not have as much damage, may want to repair, and some may be totally outside of the hazard zone, but they could still use the measures to retrofit. And the reason is, say Ida goes like this, that's fine, but 5 years from now, another hurricane may go like here. And that's why you want to prepare all of these hurricane-prone regions, you know, not only the ones that were hit, but the ones that are vulnerable. Okay, so here are the key observations. You want to consider resilient measures, not only repair and rebuild, but to retrofit undamaged structures, and consider some of these in when you create new building codes. Say sealing the roof deck with bitumen tape, that's a pretty simple measure and can be quite effective. Or using ring shank nails. You want to make sure you have a continuous load path that ties the roof to the foundation for any rebuild, and it will need to be because they'll have to follow new codes. But it's also possible to add a lot of this during repair and retrofit. And you want to protect the envelope of your house. You know, make sure the roof deck is attached to the trusses well. Seal the roof deck. Make sure your shingles are on the roof deck well, and also protect your windows, soffits, doors, and garages. Here's what the report looks like. It's currently online. We put it online yesterday. It's at the Hawaii Sea Grant website in the resources section. That's easier to remember, or you could try and just click this link and it'll get to there. And some of the other partners may put it in their websites also. We encourage that. We just heard from St. Charles Parish today that they approved of the report, and we'll see what happens from there. But this is version 1.0. We imagine that it'll grow as we get more input. And just wanted to thank a lot of different partners for the book. Here's for the report. Here's Simpson Strong Tie here. And you know, one of the things we found, there was a concern that a lot of people, residents in these hazard areas, would be shell-shocked and wouldn't want to talk to anyone. But we found out that almost everyone we encountered, they wanted to talk to us. Okay, so here's this team from Simpson Strong Tie. Here's the team from LSU Sea Grant, Julia Lively, Melissa Daigle, Nikki Pace, and then here's Jim Wilkins and Nikki Pace, and here's Joe Gano and Jason Taster. This is in the St. Charles Emergency Operations Center office. That's where they requested us to provide guidance. And the last slide, I just wanted to put this slide there. A lot of the places we visit, there's no people there. It's kind of sad in a way, but when I see this, it makes me realize, there were lives that were greatly impacted, and there's a great amount of hardship, and we got to think about the lives they were living. And one of the reasons we do this is to try and prevent as much of this damage as possible in the future. Okay, so that's all I have for today, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Julia. That was really interesting and informative presentations. Does anyone have any questions for either Dennis or Julia?
Well, I want to thank both Julia and Dennis for really excellent presentations on different aspects of structural vulnerabilities. I think Dennis is talking about the physical structures, the buildings and the damage to the physical environment. And I think Julia started by really talking about the social vulnerabilities, the impacts to people and households and communities. And I would like to invite both of them, both Julia, perhaps first to react to Dennis's presentation, and then perhaps Dennis, you might react to Julia's presentation as well. So Julia?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Dennis, I really enjoyed your presentation. And I think similar to what Carl mentioned, you really addressed a lot of the structural vulnerabilities. And the picture that I was particularly drawn to was the debris and the debris management, because that's what I wrote my dissertation on. And I think issues related to debris management, I mean, I found this during my dissertation, also connect to social vulnerability in the sense that I found that a lot of the counties that were had higher median incomes and other types of resources were more likely to have debris management plans, and then that overall gave them a better possibility of having a quicker and less costly response and recovery. And like without the plan and without the preparation, the money for debris management was then falling on the taxpayer dollars. So that was definitely a connection that I saw. And so many of the other structural issues related to roofing and structural mitigation and base flood elevations, and just investing in all of that, before the disaster, and the amount of money that saved, and really how that helps to prevent vulnerability both in response and recovery.
Yeah. Thanks, Julia. And when I saw your report, I was thinking how it tied into ours, because we see a lot more damage in older houses, older structures, and generally, I mean, it's not always the case, but at least for the places that I saw, and I was only there for 6 days. I didn't see everything, all the communities, but generally it seemed like the older structures were in poorer neighborhoods. So that's like, it's relating to like the building codes with social vulnerability in a way, because like if they're not as well-to-do, they may not live in some of these nicer neighborhoods that and you mentioned some of that. Some of them also could, I couldn't tell because I spoke to as many people as I could, but a lot of times they weren't there. So but I got the sense that maybe not all of them may have been English speaking also in some of the poorer neighborhoods also.
Yeah, I'd like to invite and encourage others on this call to also reflect upon these two presentations in terms of some of the work that we're doing in terms of rapid damage assessment, integrating, Dennis, I really like the integration of the satellite imagery and then the on-the-ground photographs. And so maybe Junath or Eric could comment on the information, and because one of the real critical needs is real-time or as close to real-time information about the types of damage and impacts that have occurred. So either Junath or Eric, would you be willing to comment on that?
Sure, Carl. Thank you. It is wonderful. Both presentations were really informative. Julia, thank you very much for introducing the method you use for the Hurricane Florence, as well as Dennis' work. I'm very familiar what you done, Dennis. That was very useful. One thing we are thinking of, or kind of grappling with, is like, are these areas, based on your conversation with locals, whoever you talk to, these areas are kind of like regularly being impacted by disasters. So were there similar kind of like recommendation in the past that they need to fix their buildings or improve their building codes and so on? Was there any kind of like this Hurricane Ida basically blew that up? Whatever they had in the place was not sufficient to basically achieve the or resist the potential damage, or it is kind of like one disaster comes and community come together, try to develop similar kind of measure, but it may not be implemented in the building codes. What kind of vibe did you feel when you were there, to Dennis, basically?
You mean in, it was hard to, I mean, and I could comment, and I'm going to also ask, because I know there's some people from LSU Sea Grant there. So Melissa Daigle or Jim Wilkins want to jump in. But I mean, I didn't talk to many, I would have liked to have talked to some of the building officials there. In fact, we were trying to set up a meeting that weekend, but I don't think, I was willing to meet with them, but I think, you know, it was like a Saturday or Sunday. But generally, you know, Louisiana did create a new building code that they adopted in 2015, but it took a while for them to implement it. And in general, all the building codes are modified, you know, through the International Building Code and International Residential Code every 3 years. And like the different jurisdictions that adopt them, you know, have a chance to evaluate those codes and see if they want to adopt them. So those are things that could be considered, but some of the things that I put in that report are not even in the modern building codes now. They're more like advanced than that. So, but they're not that expensive, like using modified bitumen tape on the seams of the plywood joints. So that's something that they should consider. And, you know, maybe we could push it in Louisiana and even in Hawaii. I'd like to think we could do it in Hawaii. And there's Jim. You have any comments, Jim?
Well, I don't think anybody's really ever done a survey on new code construction versus old code construction. I think that's probably, I mean, your observations are probably the first on that, Dennis. So we don't really have the data on that. Yeah, we did adopt new building codes after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and but it would be a very interesting study to take a look at that. I'd like to ask Julia a question if I could.
Yes.
Has anybody done any work on the psychology of disaster? Because we see people who are just really stunned and dazed from having their lives turned upside down and really don't know how to react to it. And your work on people seeking help and so forth, the factors you listed there, ethnicity, income, and so forth. But I don't see a lot of information on the psychology of it all. And you know, we see a lot of people who don't really want strangers coming in and observing their demise and their damaged state and so forth. So have you seen any data or information on that topic at all?
That's a very good question. Thank you for your question. My understanding is it's a field that's starting to grow within emergency management. I don't think that it's been very prominent in the past, but there's more and more discussion about it. I actually had a discussion with some of the local practitioners about that pretty recently, following an event that occurred here. And we just started my program. I'm in an emergency and disaster management degree program is what we call it here. And we just recently adopted a new curriculum. And one of the courses that we added is all about like stress and personal welfare and really getting to the emotional aspect to it, to disasters.
I'm glad to hear that. I think it's, you know, it's a very important topic.
Absolutely.
Places like Louisiana, when we have disaster after disaster, it really builds up on people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think these are important considerations that our center has also been looking at as well too, and the role of social capital, the role of these sorts of relationships between communities and organizations before, during, and after disasters. But one of the questions I wanted to go back to has to do both for Julia and for Dennis and Junath and others that are involved in this, is how well did our predictive models perform? How well did HAZUS perform? How well did the slosh model perform? You know, we use these as kind of predictive models, and I think one of the great things about this research that we're trying to promote or to better is not just the difference between places that have old building codes or up-to-date codes, but actually how well are some of the models and tools that we routinely use for trying to predict or estimate damage that comes from these events. Do you have any comment, Julia or Dennis, or maybe Junath or Eric can also weigh in?
I didn't compare any of the models, but going in, and actually Jim would know more of this because I didn't follow Ida as closely as I imagine people in Louisiana were following Ida. And but I think all along they knew that the storm surge wasn't going to be as large as it was for Katrina. One, because it wasn't as large an event. I mean, in terms of the diameter of the tropical cyclone, and also you know, where it made landfall. But I think the surge was pretty accurate, wasn't it, Jim? The predictions on it.
Yeah, we have a hurricane center that uses that's called SARA. I don't know what the acronym stands for now, but they do some pretty good work. But the problem with it is they're a little behind in their timing on the storm. So it was we had to depend on NOAA mostly for their predictions. But the hurricane did do some unexpected jogging back and forth here and there, and that was good for some areas and bad for others.
in response to Carl's question, I think for me, just based on my past research and experience, is when you talk about like models and accuracy, what comes to my mind is the debris management. And I remember when I was working with the debris management plans and even with the training when I worked for NDPTC, one really important component was being able to forecast the debris in advance, because a huge part about that was then knowing how much storage do we need and how much available storage should we be looking for in the planning phase for where to store the debris, because that oftentimes means getting permits to even operate those as temporary debris centers. And I remember the two main models for forecasting debris. One of them, of course, is HAZUS, and there's the different options in HAZUS for the models that you can run. And the other one is the Army Corps of Engineers, which created an equation based on the total number of households, the amount of vegetation and business in the area, as well as the storm factor, and that one operated with a 30% margin of error, both over and under. So I found when I was doing my dissertation research and interviewing different emergency managers post-disaster, there was just a lot of mixed feedback about like both. Not everyone used HAZUS, but most of them had used Army Corps because they learn about that one in a lot of the FEMA trainings, and there was just a lot of mixed feedback. Some found it to be accurate and helpful for them post-disaster, and some found that it was very off, especially in terms of coming up with the type of debris that might be generated, which of course has a huge impact on the needs. So I guess for me, one thing I learned from that experience in planning is just to really try and use both models if possible, because they bring different advantages to the table in the planning phase.
So this Eric. So one of the things that Carl mentioned about what do you call that, our damage assessments, or how we're using these models. What we're trying to do is run these models pre-disaster, right? So we run the HAZUS model, see where the potential areas that are you have debris, and then as well as the storm surge. And then we also take the information from NOAA that provides the slosh and as well as their wind field, and see where are the areas that potentially could have the most damage. And from that's how we try to narrow it down to, where are the areas that actually that have damage from satellite imagery. They try to combine all these technologies as well as what Julia mentioned, social vulnerability, looking at what areas are most vulnerable, and what Dennis said about, most times those are homes that are of these people that are socially vulnerable as well. So what we're trying to do is just combine a lot of these factors to narrow down where to focus our efforts, because we can't pretty much cover the entire state when we're trying to do these damage assessments, and we're trying to figure out, the best way and the quickest way to get information to the decision makers.
Yeah, to chime in on Julia's kind of like reflection on the HAZUS, I also noticed that sometimes these models, overshoot on the estimates, especially about the impacted kind of like houses or amount of debris generates. HAZUS also is kind of like big model, national model, but it presents the estimates towards the higher end, basically, more than kind of like actual kind of expected damage. So I think consolidating all these different models together, and also integrating more like automated system to estimate some of these damages will be moving forward. Basically, integrating aerial images, satellites, drones, and also what Dennis collected, those very beautiful images, all these detailed images that can be very helpful to moving forward to integrate to build kind of like automated system to quickly estimate the damage.
Yeah, I think part of our strategy for focusing on Grand Isle and then also, especially in St. Charles Parish, was to try to get a kind of consolidated database where we would have multiple sources for which we could do assessment of the quality of HAZAS and these other models that are used for predicting or estimating the amount of damage, the type of damage, and so forth. And certainly extending it beyond just the kind of physical structures and the debris and the types and volume of debris that is that's generated, to also include these very important social and human factors as well too. So I think this is part of the ongoing work that we're going to be trying to work with, and I think that there'll be more opportunities to collaborate and share information, and then apply this to both improvements in guidance as Dennis is suggesting for homeowners, property owners, but also for planning departments, and then beyond that for those that are working to build resilience for vulnerable at-risk communities. So I don't know, I see a lot of comments in the chat. I don't want to miss anything important. So if anyone has anything, I would encourage them to speak up, turn your cameras on, turn your mics on, and let's have a free-for-all. Right?
Yeah, this is Jimmy from Manoa. I just want to add that thank you all for the presentations. You know, Dennis, you've been a rock star from day one, and Dr. Crowley, thank you again for once again reiterating how your research basically it supports all the other previous research. And the article I just provided, it says again, this is a nutshell: the most vulnerable groups remain the most underserved. You know, so thank you both for bringing that. My question really is knowing all this, the risks and everything else. I mean, we had a near miss with Hurricane Lane a couple years back. How do we get more people to take action?
I've been working on that for years. And one, I think government doesn't pay enough attention to education and outreach of the community. I mean, they fund a lot of projects and research, but educating the community is a continuous process. And we did a communication plan for our legislature 2 years ago. And, you know, it requires a lot of different avenues, you know, not only traditional education and outreach, but like, you know, we did things like some things that were, you know, providing, say, educational credits for professionals. You know, in our state, we have like 5,000 real estate agents or 5,000 insurance agents or something like that. That's a way to reach them, you know, because they all have insurance education requirements. There's just a lot of different ways to reach them, but it really involves an concentrated effort, continuous effort to reach the community, the public in general. And you know, that's why we did the homeowners handbook, actually, to target homeowners. So
yeah, Dennis, on that point, I would say I would tout the Sea Grant model of agents and representatives that live in the communities that they serve and are trusted sources of information. We're calling them neutral brokers now, used to call them honest brokers, we're calling them neutral brokers now, but it seems to be, people seem to listen to people they know rather than government representatives that swoop down whenever there's a disaster and so forth. So I'll put a plug in for Sea Grant here.
Yeah. I have one last comment, Carl.
I'm sorry, I think Rob Porro was about to say something.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to kind of piggyback on Jimmy's question. First, great to see you, Julia and Dennis. It's been a long time. Thank you for your presentations. But yeah, kind of piggybacking on Jimmy's question, how to get people to take action. You both touched on this a little bit, but it seems there's a straight line between social vulnerability in some cases to physical vulnerability, especially at the building level and vulnerability of individual homes. This highlights a lot of the environmental justice issues, right? Especially in terms of citing this type of development back in the day. And there's some momentum to address some of those issues with future planning. But I'm wondering, at the individual home level, in your research, have you come across programs, and maybe this is more for Dennis, especially when you come up with recommendations, have you come across programs to kind of cut that line and help some of those with maybe less financial means to implement some of the recommendations you're promoting? Because they do cost money.
Yeah.
And education, I think I agree, is really important, because a lot of homeowners don't know about these strategies that they can take, but those that maybe do and just don't have the means to. Have you come across any, I don't know, grant programs or assistance to help those folks beyond, say, insurance and maybe IA? Obviously, there's limitations to that, and they're limited to post-disaster settings, but maybe any assistance for pre-disaster to kind of take care of some of these things.
Yeah. Well, two things. We do inform homeowners of all potential financial incentives. So it could be insurance discounts. This is pre-disaster too. It's not post-disaster. For retrofits, there's some counties that give property tax credits for building a safe room. And so that's one aspect of it. And then the other part of it is more and more states are using FEMA money to provide grants for retrofits. So there's a program like Fix the Bricks, or to deal with earthquake activity. And there's like Sooner Safe to build safe rooms in Oklahoma, and Brace and Bolt, I think that's in California. We actually applied for a brick application for a home retrofit program last year. It didn't get funded, but we're gonna try and do it again this year. And our legislature is also involved in that also. So for all the people not in Hawaii and other states and parishes or counties, try and get your political leaders involved and see if they could create some financial incentive for people to retrofit. And again, it's a lot of education and outreach, because some of the stuff that we just learned today just recently with Ida, I think some of it was known, but it wasn't very publicized very well to decision makers, but like things like sealing your roof deck, that's not that expensive. If you'd use option 2, that could be like an extra $700 or something like that. That could make a huge difference, preventing your roof from leaking, so again, it's education and outreach, and not only the homeowners, but your decision makers too. Yeah. And try and be creative and come up with something that they could use, even use the FEMA and the grant programs, to get something going.
Well, I don't know about you all, but I could spend the rest of the afternoon talking, or the rest of the night for some of you, talking about these really important issues. But I'm afraid that we are out of time. And what I want to do is to thank all of the participants, our presenters, especially our team who pulled together our monthly third Thursday. Thank you, Russell and Ricky, for facilitating all of this. And with that, I want to bring this month's third Thursday to a close with appreciation and aloha to you all.